It's a huge pleasure to have Calum on this episode. Thank you for coming on, Calum.
Thank you very much for having me.
You and I studied our part ones together. We did our undergrads in architecture at Sheffield. Do you have good memories from back then?
Yeah. I think a lot of what I do now is probably because of that time that we spent.
It was good fun.
Together.
We had fun. Would you say you're still having fun with architecture?
Yes, the most part. I think it can be difficult though. Sometimes it's not necessarily what you are taught or kind of think that it might be when you first start off. But I think there's still a lot of good things about it.
Are you currently doing your part 3?
I qualified as an architect in February, kind of March time this year. So after 9.5 years since starting.
Congratulations, that's amazing. Let's get straight into it. I mean, what's really interesting about some of your work that you did at Masters, I remember us talking about, and some of the conversations we've had since, is you were talking about this idea that of the role of the architect, I guess, changing, and something that interested me in particular was your thoughts on how architecture or design of space is becoming a more open thing and something that's becoming more accessible to non-architects. Obviously with Khizr Studio, the whole point of Khizr Studio is to try and elegantly and effectively communicate architecture and the nuances of it and landscape and urban design. So in your opinion, what is this kind of like changing, what are your thoughts on that, on the changing nature of the architect?
I think generally there's a bit of a shift to architecture that isn't necessarily just designed by architects who traditionally would sit above everybody else and kind of impose a design decision or a way of existing or a space on other people. There's a lot more discussion on co-design or how you can bring other people or the people that you're designing a space for into conversations around what their spaces might be, or work that kind of empowers people to take more of an involvement. Because say, for example, my mum asked kind of, would I be able to do a design for a bike shed, absolutely tiny. And then a kind of throwaway comment she made was, well, I'll just go and I can just do a planning application for it. It's fine, actually. I don't need you. And I sort of thought, oh wow, that makes me feel a little bit like, was it really worth doing 9.5 years of studying when actually, that's obviously a very small example, but I think it then touches on ways in which other people can get involved. And you see things where architects can have an impact more so in the organization and understanding of the way that the system works, as opposed to necessarily being the thing that you get taught about at school, which is you're going to have this idea about a big change that you're going to make in the world, and you're going to make a building that will do that. That just isn't the case. You won't make a building and a community will suddenly exist. So I think there's much more understanding, or a lot more projects I see about that.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because actually in the previous episode with Robbie, we discussed this idea of, you mentioned, a community makes a place. And we were talking about, or my sort of view on this is, when we studied architecture, we're sort of, maybe it's an ego thing, but we're kind of given the mantle of the designer, and we are going to provide a solution to a problem. And that is going to be a physical solution which it manifests in a building. Somehow we're going to compose a space in a certain way, and it's going to solve the problems of a certain community. And obviously at Sheffield, the course is very socially oriented, so we had a lot of these kind of problems that we were given, thrown at us. I feel like that kind of aspect of human nature was missed out, or maybe that aspect of time, which is kind of hard to teach anyway, but it wasn't emphasized enough. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is the places that we love the most, the places that we can probably all recount from memory, and the places that have legacy are those that we have memories of, the places that we have memories of being together, and being together communally, whether it's with your family or whether it's in the wider community, whether it be like a church or a mosque or something, or even a bar, these places that we gather as people and come together. So it interests me, like, what do you think that what that word means, the architect, is changing, or do you think that there's new other roles that are opening up, which take a longer term view on this and maybe look at the temporality of space and not just space in a certain point in time?
Mm-hmm. I think the role of the architect is changing in part, I guess, necessitated or because of the changing responsibilities that we have. Mm-hmm. But also I think in part there's an issue with the idea that the architect is there to design, and what people generally will see who are not architects, I would think, is new buildings and creation of new spaces, when actually I think with things like the climate crisis, or even just the affordability of designing something new, and the issue with kind of erasing a part of history, that there's kind of an ongoing repair needed of spaces, and the role that we play in. We're not kind of taught it, but we're almost the facilitators in a lot of situations, because we're the person or the people that sit in between lots of different stakeholders, sort of like the mediator, because in the world that we live in, we're not the ones with the money, or in a way, therefore, the means to create new spaces in some ways. If that kind of answers your...
Yes, I suppose in a way. And also the one thing I want to bring in, just to add on to that, is social media. So we're talking about buildings, physical spaces meaning something because they bring people together. Mm-hmm. In the modern day, as of, let's say, the last 10 years, those spaces where we meet each other and speak to each other have started to move into this online arena, so into the cloud, so they're not physical three-dimensional spaces. Do you think that arena, the kind of digital world, do you think it can have meaning to us in the same way as a physical space where we interact might have meaning to us? Or do you think it's our very nature as humans that we've reached this kind of technological peak, and it's our very nature to almost yearn for that physical interaction?
I think it's interesting because we kind of come from a position where we were able to see life before and after, or during that development.
You mean like people around our age?
Yeah, and I think it's difficult to imagine a world where we're just online, because I think the physical interactions that you have are very difficult to replicate in a digital space. But then there's also a question of, if you haven't experienced that kind of to the extent that maybe a lot of people have, and this is partly the issue with the people that are designing for, or sometimes are designing for future generations, are looking at a picture of the world from
which has changed,
their opinion and their viewpoint, which is only natural, but the speed at which things develop, I think you have to be very nimble, or find ways that you can design the spaces so that they can also change. But in a way, for me at least, I don't think the digital space replaces the physical or the natural world. I think it's a addition, but it's not a replacement. But how do you find that relationship between the two?
I think I agree with you, but it's difficult. Like, part of me is playing devil's advocate on this and thinking, well, we're of a certain generation and we've been trained to design in a certain way and see the future in a certain way. Is it that future generations will take a lead on that, or will they have their own view on things? And I think we're at this kind of point where it could go either way. It's really interesting to see how it will go. I mean, your what you said, which was interesting, designing for flexibility, so allowing functions of spaces to change. The examples I've seen of this, and maybe it's a new style of architecture we need to develop, but it seems that it strips the soul of a place away, almost, the identity of a place, of a space, of an architecture, purely because that architecture doesn't know what it is, or doesn't know what it will be.
Yeah.
So are we basically saying then that we're either going to have a future where we have very flexible spaces, but they're void of any character, or are we saying that we continue to design the way we do and not factor in this huge technological change? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is.
I think there's a funny flexibility, or designing your space to be something in the future that we don't know what it is now, or it's something that was quite common at university. It's something you see in a lot of projects, but I guess now the conversations are more around designing for disassembly or reassembly and repair, or but it's also about appreciating, like you were saying before, spaces are a lot of the spaces that you think about or you have strong memories over. And there was a discussion in a talk, an Open City talk the other day, about replacing, say, a market space with lots of kind of new shops, or replacing them with shops that are now popular or can afford to exist in that space. You're then stripping out everything that potentially or does make that place and that space what it is. And you could argue there are some places you look at and they're not particularly architecturally exciting or inspiring, or in their kind of built form or something like that. But actually the architecture is there as a vehicle, not as a... And I think that's something that is can be frustrating, that a lot of the time you sort of say, well, what's this? You go back to, what is this project for, or what is the purpose of this? Because if you're designing a school, for example, and there's a risk between the school being built at all, or your detail or the kind of finish of something not being perfect or what you wanted it to be, they're the kind of difficult points that you come to as an architect.
What do you see as like what would you like to? I mean, maybe you're already doing this, but what is your ideal space to occupy within the architectural world? Like, what would you like to be designing? And I know that we both discussed this earlier. Like, we both love architecture. You know, it's something that we both really enjoy. So I know, like, you know, and you're an architect through to your core. So where do you see you applying those skills going forward? Do you see it more in the reuse of existing space, or do you see it in designing new flexible spaces, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's probably a bit of both, but not. I think that if they are new spaces that are flexible, it's a difficult field. As I said before, lots of people have tried to design buildings or modules or kind of repeatable spaces that can be a shop or a house.
Well, there's a few
office.
practices that have tried like modular style architecture as well.
Yeah, and I think there's something inherently interesting about designing for around an existing space or an existing building, and there's a lot of complexity in that, and something that I think is really enjoyable about architecture is the number of different and changing problems that you're working around and solving, and existing buildings provide a lot of that, be it frustrating or enjoyable at different points.
Does that then go more into interior design?
I think it begins to,
and maybe these definitions are the same thing. I mean, I've always seen interior design and architecture as a very similar sort of thing. We were always, in our university work, you know, made to look at the internal quality of a space. I mean, I'm sure, obviously, you know, interior design goes into much more detail in certain aspects. But do you see these kind of disciplines kind of coming together in a certain way? We already see, if we look at the wider scale, we already see landscape architecture and architecture is being, we're seeing courses kind of prop up where they're teaching these two things together, and you're being forced to think at an urban scale and also down to the domestic scale. Is there like another level to it where we're going to be pushed towards now thinking much more down to the kind of detailed scale of an interior quality of a space?
I think the way that I've studied and the work that I've done, it has always encompassed all of it, and so it's not something that is unnatural to think about, because inherently, if you're designing a space for a purpose, you have to have thought about how that's going to be finished off, rather than designing a shell for the space to be created within it. I think there's layers to, you are designing that shell, but you're also making it work for the purpose that you're designing for at that point in time.
So for you, what's the priority? Is it reuse of space, or is it giving a space more of a legacy in, and maybe they're both similar things, but in terms of what it means to the community, what it means to people? For you, what's the more important thing? Is it the climate emergency, or is it that aspect of giving the human aspect of the space?
I think trying to not say both.
Well, I was going to say, or is it both?
I think they're both important,
They're both important.
And they can be connected. So if you're reusing a space, but you're designing it without a community or somebody, a use that is going to be within there, one, I think it can be quite difficult to do in the first place, but also then you're sort of creating something for the purpose of creating it. Whereas that's where I think it gets into the people that it's for, and that I guess that legacy doesn't even need to be, it's the people that are there at first, but then there's if it gets replaced, say you're designing a storefront, and then later on it becomes a cafe, and then it becomes a phone shop, and then it might be a hairdressers.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that is going to be what's happening, but it's trying to find that idea that you're creating a building that helps the people at the point in time that you're designing for. And you can only really design in a way for the least amount of impact on the climate at that point in time, but also an understanding that if that building is going to change, making it as easy as possible for it to change in the future, so that it works for both the people that you design it for, and even if those people are the same people later in the building's life, being able to adapt it so you're not creating an architecture that is wrapped up, glued together, and everything is pristine at that point in time. But then in order to make it change, you essentially have to remove every layer of it in order to make something new. Well, this idea of new is an interesting one, because
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that new is how we define existing today, but it's just how you repurpose that space.
yeah, it can be renew. Yeah, the idea that your building lasts 60 years or however long, and then what happens to it at that point or after that point.
Do you have any examples of this, or is this a new thing that you think we're going to see more examples of?
I don't think it's new, but I think it's maybe more. It's become more prominent in my focus. I'm not sure about the wider architectural industry, but there are a lot of practices that focus. It's moved, I guess, from heritage architects that have done that for a long period of time, and if you're working with listed buildings, for example. But I think, say, like the architecture repair, that are looking at various different forms of repair, but that doesn't necessarily have to be architecture. It's just that in the built environment, that's the kind of prime example of it.
I wonder if ego has something to play into this, because I remember when we were at architecture school, everyone, it was a very competitive kind of atmosphere. Everyone had this grand idea of a new type of building. They were going to make their mark on the world. And maybe it's something innate in us as humans. You know, we have this feeling that we want to leave our mark on the world. And that was kind of nurtured and pushed so that we produce and design better architecture. This idea that you're talking about was, and maybe it's not a bad thing, but it wasn't pushed as in such a way. Maybe it's good in a way that if that was what you were interested in, you could look into it, but it wasn't pushed in such a way. And I wonder, is it kind of a mind shift almost? Like we need to stop thinking about this producing new hot stuff. We need to start thinking more about, and maybe we need to make it more appealing and more attractive, that this idea of reusing space.
Yeah, I agree. I think the notion that something, I mean, it comes down or comes back to the kind of consumption. The idea that something new is always better. You've got some new clothing, or you've got more food, or new types of kind of content from a social media perspective.
And for instance, on a city level, a new building will always get, a new Foster's building will get the headlines. You'll never see a building which is, you know, it used to be this thing, or maybe it's happening more now.
I think there's more coverage of buildings that are reusing existing structures, or say the Oxford Circus M&S building as a kind of prime example. That was originally to be demolished, and then there was a large kind of backlash to that. I think it was then the AJ, I think, had a design competition for reimagining what the reuse might look like, which I found it was interesting, but a little bit of a funny kind of, we're going to have a design competition, so lots of architects will in some way give us some free designs for what this might be, which I was kind of unsure about.
Why? Because it's free work, essentially.
It's free
work.
Ideas.
Yeah.
But that obviously is because we operate in a system where we're required to continually grow, and money is key to an architecture practice surviving or flourishing, or as an individual. So I think that idea of growth is part of the problem that we look at, and often it can be it's more interesting for a lot of people to make something new. You have much more control over it.
So are you kind of almost pointing, and I think we've talked about this before, but are you kind of pointing to a deeper, more underlying issue that is this idea of growth? So maybe it's, do you have any thoughts on that concept of growth, which I suppose comes from this, a capitalistic structure that we live under? Do you have any thoughts on that, and any wider commentary on that?
I think capitalism, is probably at fault for a lot of issues that we see across the spectrum of society, not just architecture. In an architectural context, you're working as a business. The idea that you can easily operate as for the greater good or purpose of society is often challenged by the existence generally of a practice, and fundamentally you're working for the people that have money or can afford to, and in some cases that might be the people that you want to design for, or that might be that a local community has raised funding for a building or kind of rejuvenation of an area, or repair of an area. I guess it depends. A lot of it, I'm kind of straying off slightly, but I think a lot of things come down to language as well. And it's something we touched on about how architects talk to non-architects. But I guess going back to the idea of kind of capitalism, we have an opinion as architects quite often, and you're kind of taught at school to that you can be the change, or you can make the change, and in a way that's just not true. If you're the system within which you're operating can stifle that. I think I find that more so at points that I just.
So what would you like? Let's say you were talking to 10-year-old Calum who wanted to make a difference. Would you tell him to go more into? It might be a bit strange question, but would you tell him to go more into architecture or more into politics? Because it is true, like in architecture school, that you're we're given such a we're fueled with such, with such motivation of, we can really make a difference in the world. And maybe when you're kind of a bit more idealistic and a bit more dreamy eyed as a student, we believe that, and maybe some of us are lucky enough to do that. But the majority, like you say, the majority cases that's not the case.
I think it's finding a way that dream, or the creativity and kind of idealism, can be nurtured or maintained. I think lots of people always say, once you get into your architecture job, it's not the same as what you kind of learnt that it was going to be about. And maybe in education, there's a balance between allowing people that understanding, but also trying to make sure that there are people that come through that are saying kind of, why can't we do better? Why can't we do this?
Do you think an answer, like for those who are in the industry and who do want to make a change, do you think the answer is having your own practice, which is obviously much harder to do than which is quite a hard thing to do? But do you think the answer is to have your own practice and to try and push that change socially, politically? Do you think you may have more power and more influence doing it that way? And obviously it comes back to the idea of capitalism. You would then obviously be operating under that framework, but you could almost lead the change from within, and you could lead the change by your own ideals, the things you want to see in the world. Do you think that's a way to do things? Do you think you might, yourself go down that route maybe in the future?
No. I think it becomes it depends on your sphere of influence. And for me, I don't think I have enough influence beyond my current practice to develop that. And I think it's more working within a office or a kind of group of change makers or thinkers that I just don't think, for me personally, the ideas that I would come up with, and it was the same throughout my undergrad and postgrad, the ideas that I come to are not as fully fledged as they would be without working or operating in a wider office setup or kind of group scenario. And I think those are for me, that highlights the benefits of having lots of different viewpoints and experiences, and that's why you have a multidisciplinary design team working on something, because making a building, however small or however big, takes a lot of people.
What value do you see in, I suppose it's not really a job role, but as the visionary? So let's say you've got this idea for how you think our procurement process should be. Do you think, and I completely agree, you would need obviously a group of very talented people to do this, but do you see any value in, let's say, yourself or someone being the reiterator of the vision, that we're trying to get to this point where we're trying to change attitudes around reuse, and do you think that there is some value in that? Because I'll tell you, like, the reason I ask is because I feel like there's a lot of voices in our industry and who agree with you. The tricky part is when it comes down to actually trying to make that change. Not many people are willing to put themselves out there. Maybe it's they don't have the right team, or maybe it's fear of failure or whatever it is. And the question really is, if we believe, and I agree with you in the way that maybe the way things should go in reaction to the climate emergency, but who's going to do it? Like who's going to step forward and do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I guess it touches on previous points that even if we want to do it, we're not necessarily the ones in control. But that's, I guess, going back to one of the early points in the podcast on who is involved in the built environment, and whether it's things like community land trusts or kind of grassroots organisations having greater opportunities, but I don't know exactly how that would manifest. I just think that with this kind of thing, it requires I think you often need broader support, so that you try and change at various levels of society.
Do you think this is where communication could help, where we can, through being able to communicate to the general public what it is we're trying to do? Because I think, although the general public are not architects and not architecturally trained, I think they feel it themselves when they walk past a street frontage which is, metal and flat and has no street dynamic, is soulless. I think they feel it, that there needs to be some kind of change. And I think your idea is really, really interesting and has potential to create spaces which have purpose and which we will maybe learn to love again, and in our lifetimes, I don't know about you, but at least the new buildings I've seen going up, they've not been that inspiring. They've not been that motivating. They've not been a place that, you can almost see a building go up and know that in 20, 30 years time it will get demolished again. They've not had that legacy to them that previously, maybe when we designed buildings, 100 years ago, maybe they had. So I think the general public get this. And like you say, maybe it's the decision makers, the politicians, which need to be on board with this. I think what I'm trying to say is all these points, all these different groups come together, and maybe is it the responsibility of the architect or of the designer to be a bit more outside of the box in their thinking, be maybe a bit more entrepreneurial in how they try and bring these groups together to try and make something happen?
Or I guess something that we've discussed with a few people in the office is around how do you brand yourself. Architecture has become very there's a kind of vision of what an architect is, what architects do, what architecture is. It was quite funny. Somebody I met at recently, it was that age-old question. Not age-old question, but that typical question you ask when you meet somebody new. So what do you do? And she said, I innovate, and just left it at that.
I like that.
Which
That's
was
cool.
quite. Yeah, I think there's a lot in that, because there's an argument that a lot of us do that kind of thing on a daily basis. But I think it's shifting our position on what we do or how we operate, and our understanding of our skill set in bringing a lot of disparate ideas or thoughts together. I guess similar to your work with Khizr Studio in condensing something into a digestible format that allows other people to feel like they can be involved. That's quite broad and non-committal, but
yeah, no, I think that's actually the point I was going to make, is that if we are able to communicate clearly our intent, our ideas, which I think we sometimes struggle to get outside of our little industry bubble. We're very good at communicating to other architects, but we struggle sometimes to communicate to non-architects.
Or I guess it's communicating as well in a way that is reciprocal, not just, here's our design, we hope you like it, we're going to come and demolish half your neighbourhood in a couple of years. It should be much more, and I think this is why people can feel disenfranchised with the buildings and spaces that are put up, is that they move either businesses or existing people out of an area and bring in what is new and kind of considered to be better. There's that idea of what is best for a place. I don't think we're necessarily the people to decide that, unless we get an understanding from the people that are there.
And like you said earlier, capital, money tends to take precedence over what is unique about that place.
Yeah. And if it doesn't make money for, and it's who it's making money for as well.
So would you like to see a more socialistic framework where money is not at the top of the agenda?
I think it becomes, and I guess it touches on things like who's able to be sustainable. If people can't afford to be sustainable because they're not able, within the system within which we work, to care for themselves and have enough to care for themselves or their community, then you don't have the option to be looking wider at the world around you, because you're having to solve your own issues. And I don't think it's necessarily something that architecture solves, but I think in that kind of context of caring more for the spaces that we inhabit, also comes down to, if people are seeing lots and lots of new demolition and the building of lots of new places and spaces, then you're going to have a fear of, well, when am I going to be next? Are we going to be next? Does this place represent me or what this area is about? And I guess there's a sort of, there can be a lot of kind of carelessness for the people that are around a new development, because a lot of the time we like to think that we can have an impact beyond the kind of red line boundary of a site, but realistically the majority of that is not done by us. Maybe in a urban design context, but even then, the stitching together of, say, a city like London, for example, is so many different patches of land, of space, and that patchwork ness is very interesting, but you're then at the mercy of who is controlling at the kind of bigger scale.
The sort of a meta sort of view I've got of what you're saying is that you're sort of emphasizing us to think more laterally, as opposed to just thinking within our little bubble, which I really like. And this idea of maybe having a more socialistic view of our framework of procurement is quite radical. I think it is an interesting one, but it is quite radical. And going back to that person you met who said they were an innovator, why don't you push some of this? Why? Maybe there's a new role. Maybe it's this idea of the architect that thinks across these different spectrums of political, social, design, development. What's stopping you from? You speak about it brilliantly, and you've got the work and the research and the education to back it up and the experience. What's stopping you from, maybe going into pushing this idea further? I mean, it's a huge thing. I mean, what you're talking about, maybe very rightly so, you're sort of thinking, this is a very overwhelming thing, and it should sit as a theoretical, hypothetical idea. But why don't you, if that's the change you wish to see, and to make our communities, our architecture better, more lovable, what's stopping you from pushing those ideas?
I guess from a personal point of view, the uncomfortability or the unknown, in a way, of how to get to that position, or where exactly to start positioning myself. There's a lot of people from my office who've moved on and gone to the public practice route, and it's sort of like a stepping stone to a more public local authority the way of working, so you have much more of an impact or a role within a broader spectrum than just my building that I'm designing in this space and my building that I'm designing here. What things are stopping me? Myself, which is probably the same for a lot of people. And I think it's something that is not going to be a change that happens straight away, albeit I think it's a kind of change that needs to happen pretty fast. And I guess it's knowing the right people, or knowing where to start to position myself.
Well, you're in a good position already, I would say. And it's a very daunting task, obviously. I mean, we're talking about a huge shift in the way that we think, in the way that we educate, in the way that we practice. But, has anything worth doing ever been easy? And has it ever been done quickly? And the answer is no. These things always do take time. But I would say you're in a very good position if, and you're absolutely right, time is running out to solve some of these problems. And maybe there's the political kind of interest in these ideas now that there maybe wasn't even 10 years ago. So yeah, and I sort of see how academia would be behind some of these ideas too. But yeah.
I think I'd like to get more involved in Sheffield again, or the LSA or something similar to that.
What's your favourite memory from Sheffield? When we did our undergrad together?
Hard to say. I think I have even when you asked about kind of favourite buildings or things like that, I struggle with like a favourite, but because there's lots of reasons why I like different things that we did. Favourite?
Well, I was hoping you were going to say, hanging out with me and,
There's too many of those, I think. I think it's just not necessarily a specific memory, but that the times within, as much as studio is very hard, I think that kind of feeling of and the discussions we'd have over different parts of each of our designs, which were all often very different briefs, different ideas.
Yeah.
I think it's those, like the conversations around what what that is, and then as well just I think drawing probably more than anything.
Yeah, you were great at drawing.
It's something I still do a lot,
Mm.
as much as possible. But how about you? What was your favourite?
That is a very good question, and I don't really know what the answer to that would be. I think I really enjoyed the competitive nature of studio, and I know that that is not something that a lot of people enjoyed, but what was, like you say about the studio environment, what was amazing is that, and one could say this is a weakness of the architecture course, in my opinion, but actually also maybe a strength, is that you're pushed on all fronts, and you're with people who are looking at stuff at the minuscule detail scale, all the way to the landscape scale, looking at different materials, different technologies. And so you kind of have exposure to all these things, which is great. But then a slight tricky thing that I found with architectural education was that you're sort of forced or pushed to be excellent at everything. And as we know in industry and practice, that's never usually the case. We'll have people who are specifically good at certain things, doing those things and being the best at those things and working within a wider team. But I fully understand why that was done, and I really enjoyed that because it pushes you to be better in your work. And then also we used to do fish and chip nights on Fridays, which were a lot of fun.
Yeah. Do you think that architects should be specialists or generalists, or a bit of both?
I think it almost doesn't matter, and I think it probably should be a bit of both, because with certain things, like some of the things you're talking about, I think require such specialism and understanding, like you have. But then if we're talking about a practice which does huge developments, hundreds of homes, I suppose in that context, the architect would need to be a bit more general. But it's interesting. I mean, in the last episode with Robbie, he was talking about how he also thinks architects will specialise and possibly splinter off the profession. So it's interesting that you're also sort of mentioning this, that this is, and I'm assuming, do you believe this is something that could happen in the profession?
I think a lot of practices specialise because of the competitive nature of winning work, but also you become but then I think it also ties into repetitive production of new buildings, in part because there's an efficiency in that from a company perspective. But I guess it's interesting whether were money not an issue in that. Would that still be the case? Would you design the building the same way because you've done it before if you didn't need to? Whereas from a generalist perspective, I think it's really interesting that some of the buildings we've designed, we've looked at the way that a hospital can be designed from the perspective of a home, or things that you can integrate between the two. And just generally, I think that I've always thought that you need to have experiences of life outside of architecture, because that's what you're designing for. And so in that, it's also being able to specialize in sections and then also then move around so that you're not just necessarily... It's hard because making a building is so technically complicated that having that understanding to as great a degree is necessary because a lot of spaces you're designing for very particular needs. So that's a kind of non-answer.
No, I think
that's why you have lots of people.
I think you're absolutely, you know, back to that whole idea of the structure that we are kind of working in, prioritizing capital and therefore looking for efficiencies. Is there anything else that we haven't covered?
I think how you, from kind of a Khizr Studio perspective, see your role developing, and whether you want the, because I know you were talking before about kind of an individual making, how you make a difference or make a change. How do you see the studio kind of making that, or growing or expanding? That's
a really good question, actually. And I think, like, from the beginning, I've always, you know, tried to push Khizr Studio as being an architectural storytelling studio. That's kind of how I describe it, because the very nature of how we tell stories is changing so quickly, and we have these. We're currently in the middle of this huge kind of technological curve where we've got AI coming, and we've got these amazing, you know, bits of software which we can use to tell stories in a way that we could never tell before. But at the heart of it is always a storytelling, and all the points that you've so pertinently mentioned, communicating those to others is the glue which holds it all together. If we are to make any kind of change, we have to understand what it is we're trying to change, and we have to understand where we're going. So I think that's the purpose I see that's the role I see Khizr Studio playing, and the nature of that may change, and I think it's very important to be open about learning new ways to tell stories, specifically with Khizr Studio. And when Khizr Studio started, the landscape of architectural storytellers was it didn't really exist in that same degree. I mean, there were architectural filmmakers who were making commercial bits of work for practice, which self-aggrandized the architect, again, feeding into the architect's ego. Maybe it was the architect sitting in front of a brick wall for 30 seconds telling you how important brick is. You know, certain things that were inaccessible to the everyday person, you know, to people who don't understand about architecture, don't have that same feeling towards bricks. But there is a way to communicate that feeling towards bricks, for example, if it's couched in the context of something which can mean something and relate to people. Because that way we can make all those little things that we labor over in the design process, we can make those things accessible. So it's sort of Khizr Studio is trying to look at how can we do that in a way how can we communicate architecture, communicate the design process and procurement and all these things in a way which is accessible, which is a tricky thing to do. But I think historically our industry doesn't really tend to adopt new technologies. It tends to there's a bit of a lag time in adopting new technologies. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the role of Khizr Studio is to essentially understand how we can continue telling these stories. And I think that's what this podcast is kind of about too, trying to remove the veil, so to speak, on some of these issues. And I think you've done a really good job of that, because we've never really properly sat down and spoken about this, and it's been really, really interesting to hear. Yeah. And I've learned so much, actually. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
And great. It's been really good, and hopefully we'll do like a part 2 maybe at some point. It would be good to see where you pursue this line of thought in a year or so, you know, and see if your ideas have changed and stuff like that. So yeah. Thank you for coming on, Calum.
Thank you very much for having me.